I've been collecting maps for a long time. In fact, the first map I was able to purchase for $16 in 1962. And I just sort of kept at it for my own amusement, never, ever imagining that there could be a traveling exhibit and a lecture at the University of Pennsylvania on this topic, with me standing before all of you and in front of the microphone. But here we are, and as the saying goes, one thing leads to another. This is a collection that really documents the exploration of the west coast of North America. Most schools in the United States, primary and high schools, teach American history as sort of a story of expansion from the East Coast toward the West Coast. In fact, the West Coast was explored before the East Coast. Many of these maps, as you will see, date from the 1500s up until the early 1600s, and the Pilgrims did not get to Plymouth Rock until December 1620. So we're going to start off with the expeditions of Francisco Coronado, 1540 to 1542, so 80 years before the Pilgrims landed. And he led an expedition of more than 200 men north of what is now Mexico into what we refer to as Arizona and New Mexico. They were the first Europeans to see the Grand Canyon, first to encounter the Hopi Pueblo and the Zuni Pueblo, the Rio Grande River, the Taos Pueblo, and it was Coronado who first heard the legend of Quivira, but I'll have more about that later. So again, welcome. I'd like to say just a word about old maps in general. They do have an appeal, I think, to almost everyone. And in fact, maps are almost as old as the prehistory of humans. The oldest map known, which was kind of a picture graph on a wall in Anatolia, has been dated to 6300 BC. And most of us relate to maps. Maps provide, on a single sheet of information, perhaps more information than can be packed onto a sheet of information, at least before computers. They also, as we'll discuss, have an artistic appeal as well as an informational appeal. So we will review this collection, which, as I've already said, starts with the first Spanish explorations up the west coast of North America and ends in 1801 with the trek of Alexander Mackenzie in 1793. You can think of this collection as representing the accumulation of knowledge that was available to Thomas Jefferson when he made the decision to commission Meriwether Lewis and Robert Clark. Many of these maps are from books, incidentally. Both the maps and the books were in Jefferson's library in Monticello. So he thought about this a lot and for many years and consulted many of these same maps that we are looking here tonight. It's always a bad idea to start a lecture with an apology, but I put this together rather than amateurish PowerPoint presentation on my Macintosh laptop. So as the maps come up on the screen, if they're not as clear as they might be, maybe that's even more motivation following this lecture to go back to the Arthur Ross Gallery and view the originals at the exhibit. And as further enticement, we will have a reception there, and there will be some pretty good wine. So a little bit more about the wine later. And at that reception, you'll have a chance to meet Dilys Winograd and her staff at the Arthur Ross Gallery, who have put this collection on display and done a wonderful job. And this gives me an opportunity to say in public how grateful I am, Phyllis, to you and your staff and all that you have done for this collection. And we're very proud to be part of the Arthur Ross Gallery and the University of Pennsylvania. Now, I'd like to make this as informal as possible. That's a little hard to do standing up here on this podium before you, but we'll certainly have questions and I hope answers to your questions after I stop talking. But as I go along, if there's anything that raises a question in your mind or requires further elaboration, please don't hesitate. Just raise your hand and I'll try to answer as best I can. And let's keep it as informal as possible. As I've already suggested, there are four major themes that I'm proposing for your consideration. The first is maps as art, but secondly, maps as history. And then thirdly, one of the wonderful things about maps is that almost every map has at least one story to tell, and quite often more than one. And together and in sequence, as in this collection, they can tell a grand story, a grand and very human story. So as we've said, the major purpose of maps is to inform a lot of information on a single sheet of paper. And the essential function is to show on that piece of paper spatial relationships between one location and another, and a way of measuring those relationships, and, as appropriate in nautical charts, a way to navigate according to those relationships. But maps do have artistic qualities, and just to make sure I was on safe ground in making that statement, I consulted the Oxford American Dictionary. I didn't go back to the Oxford English Dictionary, Katrina, but I think it's the same definition, actually. The production of something beautiful, skill or ability in such work. So I leave it to you to judge whether maps really fill that definition. Here's a pretty good example. This is a map, the first map ever made of the Pacific Ocean, called Maris Pacifici by Abraham Ortelius, published in Antwerp in 1589. This map has original hand color, painted by very careful ladies, I suspect. At the time it was published, it was contained in an atlas within many other maps, bound in that fashion, kept on a library shelf for literally centuries, therefore fully protected against light and air, which are the two major enemies of preservation for maps, and incidentally for wine, so something to keep in mind. So here you can see the Pacific Ocean, and you can see in the foreground off the coast of Ecuador and Chile a ship, and that is a representation of Magellan's flagship, the Victoria. You remember Magellan is the first European or first known individual to circumnavigate the world. He sailed from Spain, from Sanlúcar, with 5 ships and 265 men. 3 years later, one ship, the Victoria, returned almost exactly 3 years, almost to the day, with 18 men. The first to circumnavigate the world, the first Europeans to transit the Pacific Ocean, which turned out to be much bigger than Magellan and Columbus before him and others thought it really was. All this was due to a miscalculation of the circumference of the Earth by the famous Greek astronomer Ptolemy, working in Alexandria in 150 AD. And Eratosthenes before him had made the calculation correctly. Ptolemy made the mistake, and that mistake was perpetuated for 1,500 years. So it was a big shock to Magellan to have to sail across a much bigger ocean than he thought. But you can see also the outline there of the Pacific coast. Obviously the bulge is much greater, but there's orange outline of California, and it is labeled as such. You can see across in the upper left-hand corner the Great Wall of China, even though no European had been there since by the time Ortelius made this map. This is Hokkaido, labeled as the Isla de Plata, and this is Japan. But here is Cape Mendocino, labeled as such, and right here, I believe, you can see Quivira Regnum, the Kingdom of Quivira. We'll come back to that later. So the point I was making with this is that these maps convey a great deal of information, but they also do have artistic qualities. Here's another example. This is a little bit later. This is a Honduras map made in 1606, also bound in an atlas, also very careful hand coloring. In this case, an Oriental ship, probably a Japanese ship, is pictured off the coast of what we would all refer to as California, suggesting that there was a trade between the Orient and the west coast of North America. And that proposition persisted for several hundred years. I'll come back to that point later. You're all wondering, I'm sure, about this scene in the lower left-hand corner where they're having quite a party, and that is not California wine. That they're making that is actually a group of Brazilian natives, and they are making a drink in these pots, and no one knows what the alcoholic content might be. But it is a happy and inviting scene. And maybe we can improve on that later this evening. Maps also record geographical knowledge, and in doing so, they display the assumptions and the cultural biases and sometimes the wishful thinking of the map maker. Here's the first map ever made of the Arctic, a polar projection by the famous cartographer Gerhard Mercator. This map was made in 1595, again beautifully hand-colored. This shows the power of Mercator's knowledge, but also his imagination and creativity. So in the center, of course, is the North Pole. I'll come back to that in a minute. This is North America, and it is labeled as California. And Mercator shows the North Pole surrounded by four islands, three of them fully drawn, and the other suggested but not quite completed. Here you can see the outline of Scandinavia, Norway and Sweden, the Baltic here, Finland there, then Russia and Siberia, comprising the other side of the Arctic Circle. This is Greenland here. So Mercator shows very clearly a northwest passage as being not only possible but very navigable from the Atlantic over the top of North America through a narrow strait and into the Pacific Ocean. He shows a pyramidical rock at the North Pole because according to the belief at that time, there was such a rock at the North Pole, and all the oceans of the world flowed in four rivers into the North Pole and disappeared into the center of the Earth to emerge somewhere else, somehow. And I did not make that up. There's a letter to that effect from Mercator in the library at the British Museum in London. So very imaginative, lots of cultural assumptions and lots of very wishful thinking, particularly with respect to the Northwest Passage. Altogether a fascinating map and a work of art as well. This is one of the very first maps devoted to the New World. It was made in Basel in 1544 from a woodblock cut that was actually made by Sebastian Münster in Basel in 1540. This is the German version, and it's labeled The New World. And for the times, it's really quite accurate. It's a fairly good rendition of the Caribbean, the Florida Peninsula, the isthmus between North America and South America. Here we have another example of cultural bias and assumption. This is labeled cannibali, and that's a human leg on a stack of wood that is about to be set fire for dinner, presumably. That may be the same group of Brazilians we saw on the other map. We're not really sure about that. Here's Magellan's flagship again. This is labeled Mar Pacificum, the Pacific Sea. This is Japan, again thought to be closer to North America than it actually is because of the miscalculations of the circumference of the Earth. Here's India Superior, or northern India, and Cathay. So India's obviously gained prominence over China as far as Münster was concerned. But he too assumes a northwest passage, and very interestingly, a separation of the North American continent and the Asian continent, although no European reached this body of water before Vitus Bering did in 1741, 200 years later. You will see this on almost all of these maps. You will see this separation. I regard this as the greatest mystery of cartography. How did they know when Bering didn't get there until 1741? And if someone knows the answer, I'd love to hear it. Incidentally, this was one of the maps, one of the very few maps that popularized the use of the word America. Here it is as Americum. And this map was reprinted many, many times and led to the use of America for both the northern and southern continents of the Western Hemisphere. I suppose I've already illustrated this point that every map tells a story. That's, of course, especially true during this period, the age of discovery, when new knowledge was unfolding with every voyage. But they also tell stories of adventure, of pride and ambition, greed, I can add to that list, of dreams, often dreams for empire, dreams for religious expansion, and hope and fear. So as you view these maps, particularly with a glass of wine in your hand, think about some of the stories that they tell. This finely engraved woodblock print by an Italian working in Venice, Castalde, Giacomo Castalde, was made in 1565. It's the first map to show the discoveries of Coronado and to push the limits of knowledge in the Spanish Empire further north. And it's a little difficult for you to see, but actually this is Sierra Nevada. It's the first map to use the word Sierra Nevada, coming in this case from Cabrillo's expedition of 1542 to 1544, right on the heels of Coronado's expedition. Cabrillo went up the coast with 2 boats. He died in the effort, but his crew returned 2 years later in 1544, and they told the story of the Great Snowy Mountains and many, many other tales. And many of the place names that are still in existence in California today come from Cabrillo's expedition. That's why almost every city and town in California has a Cabrillo High School or a Cabrillo Street. very well known. This map also shows Quivira, and that derives directly, as I said earlier, from Coronado's expedition. Very briefly, the origin is that Coronado set forth looking for the 7 cities of Cibola, which were believed to be tall white buildings, streets paved with gold, very rich civilized people. That rumor had persisted in New Spain for several decades, and finally the governor of New Spain commissioned Francisco Vasquez de Coronado to find Cibola. He was 28 years old when he set out and commanded this expedition with 200 Europeans and a number of natives, horses, cattle, whole works. A very well-stocked expedition, and a very ambitious young conquistador in charge. As I said earlier, they were the first to encounter the Grand Canyon, the Hopi Pueblo, the Zuni Pueblo, the Rio Grande, the Taos Pueblo. They went down around the southern rim of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. All of this took a year, and all Coronado had to show for it were a few pieces of turquoise. No tall buildings, no streets paved with gold, no civilized societies, at least by their standards. So you can imagine the mindset of this ambitious conquistador when an Indian along the Pecos River said, "It sounds like you're looking for my home kingdom. It's a wonderful place, fabulously rich agriculture. The fish in our rivers are as big as your Spanish horses. Our king takes his meals off of golden tableware with golden utensils. Altogether a wonderful place." And naturally, Coronado said, "What is this place called?" And the Indian, whatever he said, what the Spanish wrote down as Quivira. It doesn't really mean anything. It was this Indian replying. And Coronado also naturally said, "Well, will you take me to this place?" And the Indian, who knew he had no choice whatsoever, said yes. So Coronado split his party, and he and some horsemen and this Indian and a few other Indian runners went east into what is now the panhandle of Texas, turned north through a pass by Amarillo, crossed what is today Oklahoma, and into Kansas. First Europeans to see buffalo grass, first Europeans to see buffalo, but no walled cities, no streets paved with gold. Finally, 20 miles west of where Wichita is located today, Coronado put a stop to the expedition. They put the Indian to torture. I won't describe that to you. Under torture, he confessed he'd made the whole story up just to get them out of the Pecos River territory. They were not very pleasant tourists. I want to tell you that. So he had had rather strong motivation. They killed him on the spot. Coronado returned to Mexico with the rest of his party, and the practice in those days was to interview each European member of any of these expeditions with a professional interrogator and a professional scribe, much like a legal deposition today. And each member of the expedition told the story of Quivira as the Indian had told it along the Pecos River originally. I guess the trouble with torture is you never really know. But that put the story of Quivira, this fabulously rich, cultured society, into circulation. It went back to Europe through the Jesuit network. It inspired the search for the Northwest Passage, particularly by the French and the English, feeling that if they could come over the top of the continent and come down the coast, the Quivirans, who were thought, among other things, to be trading with the Orient, could lead them to a Western trading route, and they could break the Portuguese monopoly on the spice trade and make a lot of money. It has, in the end, generally to do with money. So that put the legend of Quivira into circulation, and it gradually fell into disuse, but we resurrected the name, and you'll taste a little of it a little later this evening, I hope. It's the name of our winery. And this is a map of Quivira Regnum, the kingdom of Quivira. It's the only map devoted exclusively to Quivira. This was made in 1593, again in the lowlands, in this case in Holland, published in Amsterdam. It's an exceedingly rare map. It was printed in only one edition of deWild's World Atlas, and it too boasts original color. It boasts charming sea monsters. This was recently used by the National Geographic in a television documentary on narwhals, and they came and actually called me because they saw this on the back label of our wine, and it was the only medieval rendition of what they thought might represent a narwhal. So they're drinking Quivira wine now too. So we have a European vessel here, and this is a rendition of what they thought what deWild thought a Chinese ship might look like, never having seen one. And that to reinforce this idea that Quivira was trading with China. And here's a buffalo. Here are natives in their tent. The city of Quivira is located right here. You can't see it very well, but you will if you visit the gallery. And once again, I think right here is Cape Mendocino, coming from Cabrillo's expedition. This is a close-up. I zoomed in on this just to give you a better idea of what I've just been talking about. Yes, this is Cape Mendocino here. Here's the city of Quivira right by a river, which is north of a place labeled capital C de capital S Francisco. So what do you know? It's pretty close. You all know that for many years it was thought that California was an island, and that myth was perpetuated by many maps. Of course, today many people wish it really were an island. I won't tell you my own thoughts about that. But this is a French map made by a very famous cartographer, Sanson. It was reprinted and copied many times. It shows the characteristic three fingers that came to be shown on most maps of California as an island. In that sense, it was certainly the most influential, and as I've said, was copied many times and reprinted many times. Here is the Rio Grande River flowing in the wrong direction, flowing southwest rather than southeast. But many of the place names that are familiar today are also on this map, including, of course, New Mexico up here. And Quivira's back here close to Wichita, Kansas this time. But I'm happy to see Canada up here for our Canadian friends. William Delisle was the most distinguished European cartographer of his time in the early 1700s. A very careful, very punctilious, very learned man, very skillful cartographer, beautiful maps. He, unlike many other of the earlier cartographers, left blank what he didn't know and didn't fill it up with his imaginations and hopes and dreams. Now, he was the court cartographer to the royal family of France. And in the very late 1600s, Father Kino, a Jesuit in Mexico, had established through a number of personal explorations that indeed California was a peninsula, not an island. And it's thought that Kino's reports, verbal reports, traveled rapidly through the Jesuit network to William Delisle, and he issued this map in 1700, and he almost reconnected California to the mainland, but not quite. Here I've zoomed in on that little piece, but he's left it really to the viewer's imagination as to whether California is a peninsula or an island. I'll just go back to that previous map for a minute, I hope. That's the area I just zoomed in on. So the normally punctilious William deLisle equivocated on this essential point. That's one of the fun things about maps. This is a very rare map from the first printed history of California by Miguel Venegas, printed in Madrid in 1757. It's a beautiful map. You'll see it at the Arthur Ross Gallery. It's a wonderful, careful lithograph with these marvelous illustrations on either side and a remarkably accurate map of what we now refer to as Lower or Baja California. These, incidentally, these are Californias and these are Californios. And again, some things haven't changed. So I jumped ahead there. I made this point earlier, but as I've said, each map tells a story, but when viewed in sequence, they can tell a grand story. And this collection spans the 250 years from 1544 to 1801, from the Renaissance to the modern age, the age of discovery, of exploration, the age of empire and contesting empires, the waning Spanish Empire, the growing British and French empires, the religious expansion, the search for immense wealth and riches, and of course, the New World and the American and other new republics in the New World. This is a map by a man named Sir Robert Dudley. He was the illegitimate son of a member of Queen Elizabeth's court, the Earl of Leicester. And when he was born, Queen Elizabeth became very upset with his father and banned him from the court and declared that this illegitimate son could not inherit any of his father's titles. In time, she relented, and in fact, Robert Dudley himself became a figure in Elizabeth's court and a very competent seaman. He married the sister of his best friend, James Cavendish, who was the third man to circumnavigate the globe after Magellan and Drake. Dudley led a naval campaign against the Spanish in the Caribbean and in the siege of Cadiz, was knighted, but he too, like his father, had extensive matrimonial difficulties and was eventually banned from the court. And Sir Robert ended up in Italy working for the Dukes of Tuscany and spent 30 years drawing these maps. He drew 146 maps, and these are the first nautical charts ever to be drawn by an Englishman. They show the Mercator projection rather than the stereographic projection where the meridians meet at both the North Pole and the South Pole. The advantage of the Mercator projection is you can navigate with a compass, and the compass will remain on the course to take you to your destination. So these maps were meant to be used at sea, and they are full of detail. And this little insert is the west coast of North America that we've been discussing. This map, as you can see, was made in 1646. Here it is labeled America, and New Albion, which was the name bestowed by Drake, but below that is Quivira Regnum, reappearing once again. Here's Cape Mendocino up here. So the familiar place names reappear. And Dudley's work was monumental. The printer of these maps calculated he used 5,000 pounds of copper to make the plates for the maps. James Cook is well known as perhaps the greatest explorer, navigator, and seaman of the modern age. This map resulted from his third expedition of 1777, 78, and 79. and succeeding explorers, including many of the fur traders who followed Cook. And it's Cook's expedition that kicked off the great fur trade in the northwestern part of the continent. When they returned to Canton, now near Hong Kong, after Cook's death in Hawaii, one of the seamen traded a few otter pelts for the astounding sum of money in today's terms of $10,000 for each pelt. That got the crew so excited that two men actually put the whaleboat over the side and started to row back to North America. And they were never heard from again. But when that ship returned to London, people really did get excited, and the fur traders began to come from England and then subsequently from New England to trade for furs up in this region of the world and sell them to the Chinese, which they did very successfully for about 20 or 30 years. And that led to the very extensive mapping of the coast. This is really quite an accurate map. And the offshore line is Cook's track. And there are also other tracks from some of the fur traders on this map as well. This is just a little snip I made by zooming in. This is the Strait of Juan de Fuca. This is Cape Flattery right here. This is the west coast of Vancouver Island, where most of the traders spent the winter and then would go further north and trade during the summer. It's full of all kinds of little tidbits. There's a dotted line here that states that this was a circumnavigation by Captain Gray, who was the man who discovered the Columbia River, sailing from Scituate, Massachusetts. So it's a little bit of an exaggeration. It also says something about a Chinese navigator who landed here in 1459, I think that's the number. So if you get a chance, get one of the magnifying glasses out and you'll see this enormous amount of detail, most of it actually quite accurate. These are the Queen Charlotte Islands, for example. This is a map of Nuka Sound, where Cook wintered in 1779. This is a map, I included this in this lecture and in the collection because it's believed that Captain Cook drew this map himself. He was, as I'm sure you all know, a very accomplished surveyor. And this is from his journals, which were published in England in 1784. It's not very well known in America, but the first European to cross from the Atlantic to the Pacific was a young Scotsman, Alexander Mackenzie, working in the fur trade in Canada. And he actually made the trek from Lake Athabasca up here, across the Canadian Rockies to Bella Coola, which is in British Columbia, where he tasted salt water and landed there or arrived there on July 23rd, 1793. And there's a rock there that he inscribed. It's since been embellished a little bit with paint and so on, but the original inscription is there to be seen today. His journey and his subsequent, he immediately returned to England, wrote his journals. They were published, a smash hit. He was knighted, returned to Scotland, never came back to the New World again, lived happily ever after, presumably. But his trek greatly strengthened the British claim to the Northwest because he claimed that he had discovered the headwaters of the Columbia River. It turned out it was actually the Fraser River. But at the time, his claim was very strong because he actually made the trip on foot. So this map of MacKenzies Journal is what decided Jefferson to finally commission Meriwether Lewis. All of the preceding maps obviously influenced him as well, but he knew now that the British had a very strong claim to the Pacific Northwest. including what we know as the states of Oregon and Washington. So he had to counter. He wanted to do it anyway. He'd been thinking about it for a long time, but now it became a matter of state. So this is the last map in this collection, and it ends on that note. But for those of you who are unable to visit the Arthur Ross Gallery and want more information, we have a website that includes all the maps, and you can just dial it up on your internet at mappingthepacificcoast.com. But you're cordially invited this evening to the gallery. The maps are on display, and with any luck, there will be a few bottles of Quivira wine there to cheer you up. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.